What's going on, everybody? This video is going to focus on how to graph hyperbolas. And typically, when I graph a hyperbola, I do it in 4 easy steps. These, just kind of depending on who you are, might not be the way you graph it, whatever. It's just a way for me to stay organized and kind of determine how this hyperbola is formed and the easiest way to find the necessary components. So I'm going to kind of break down my steps real quick, and then we'll jump straight into 2 examples. So step 1, I find my center. Well, we all know, if we've been working through these conics now, my center is HK. But, and I'm going to put a little star here, I have to be extremely careful with finding the center of a hyperbola, because sometimes they can be written as y squared minus x squared. And if that's the case, a lot of people will try to go and pull out that HK, but it's backwards. So we've got to be very, very careful, make sure that we always pull the x value first, and that goes in our center, and then the y value, okay? And we'll see a little bit of an example of that in just a moment. Step 2, Step 2, I like to find my vertices and co-vertices. I'm just going to put coverts. Now, there's obviously a lot that goes into that, finding those two. With my vertices, that's going to come from my transverse axis. And my transverse axis is whatever variable, if it's x squared or y squared, whichever one is positive. Then I'm going to find my co-vertices. That's going to come from what's called my conjugate axis. And that comes from the denominator of whatever variable is negative. Okay, so I'll explain all of that in just a moment once we get to our example. But step 3, I draw my box and graphs. And again, I will show you all that in just a moment. And finally, step 4 is my foci. And your foci for a hyperbola is going to be the square root of a squared plus b squared. And I'm going to call that f just in regards to this video. So using these simple steps, finding my center, then finding my vertices and co-vertices from my transverse and conjugate axes. Then I'm going to draw my box and my graphs. And then lastly, I'm going to find my foci. So without further ado, let's check this first example. So the first thing I see, step 1, is find my center. Well, remember, my center is always HK, where H comes from the X value and K comes from the Y value. And this is what I was saying, we've got to be careful, because in regards to this formula, X comes second. So I'm looking at whatever value is right here with X. Well, it's 0, we get that. Therefore, my center is going to be at 0, and then wherever the Y value is at is also 0. So in that particular case, my center will be at 0, 0. But I wanted you to be very careful about trying to find that center if X and Y are flipped. So with that being said, I've got my center. Step 2, find my vertices and my co-vertices. Now, this is kind of the big meaty part of finding out, of graphing a hyperbola. Now for us, first thing that I want to do is I want to say, hey, look, y is my positive variable. So what that tells me is that this is going to be my value of A, which is part of my transverse axis. Now that's very helpful. It also tells me that because y is positive, my graph is going to open up and down or vertically. That tells me that my B value is underneath my X, and this is my conjugate axis because it's negative. Okay, so with that in mind, what I want is simply to find the value of A. Well, I find that value of A by taking the square root of that denominator, and that gives me 5. So now, because I have my transverse axis, I have my value of A, I can find how far up and down, and I say up and down because, again, I'm vertical here. I'm going to move up 5 units from my center. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to move down 5 units from my center. And now bear in mind, my vertices are going to be where my graph actually touches. Okay. Now, I want to use my B value, and you'll have to pardon me, I'm going to use my B value, which is the square root of the conjugate, the conjugate axis, which gives me 4, and that tells me how far left or right I move. So now I'm going to move 1, 2, 3, 4 to the right, and I'm going to move 4 to the left. And I now have, I now have my vertices and my co-vertices. Now this is very helpful to me because now I can go to step 3. And step 3 tells me, hey, draw your box and your graph. Now my box, this is a little trick that I've used. This is kind of where some people are like, I don't like the way he's teaching this, or I don't like the way he does that. My box is simply connecting all of my points. And the reason that I personally like this is because once I get here, I know that my graph will open up off of my 2 vertices points, but they all open up around and in between what? Well, my asymptotes, right? Well, my asymptotes will actually run from the points of the corners. Ooh, that was a terrible drawing. So was that. I'm sorry. And I could go and find the equation of these lines, these asymptotes, because this is indeed one of my asymptotes. And remember, an asymptote is simply a line or a particular area where a graph will never cross. Well, what's going to happen here is my hyperbola will open up around that asymptote. And it's going to do the same thing down here. And that's it. And so with that in mind, when on step 3, when I draw my box and I draw my graph, I can answer a few different questions. If my teacher told me, hey, go and find the equation of that asymptote, give me the 2 equations, because we obviously have 2 asymptotes, I could just do slope formula. I could do rise over run. That gives me my slope. What's my y-intercept? It's 0. So you can find a bunch of different things from that. And let's kind of backtrack too. What if your question said, hey, what is the length of my transverse axis? Well, transverse axis is just 2 times A, which here would be 10, right? Length of my conjugate axis, 2 times 4, is 8. So we can find all of those. That's very easy. We've done those in ellipses as well. But finally, step 4 tells us to find our foci. And I find my foci by taking the square root of 25 plus. That's the difference between an ellipse and a hyperbola here, is that 1, my foci are found by adding my denominators. That's going to give me the square root of 41, which is approximately 6.4. And when I plug that into my graph, again, my foci is always going to sit in the cup of my graph. And how far above the center and below the center? 6.4. So there's 6, and somewhere about right there. Somewhere about right there. And that's my graph. So I hope you feel pretty good with this. Graphing a hyperbola is not the easiest thing on the planet, but I hope that it makes a little bit more sense to you now. So let's try one more.